everybody, and welcome to the second in ResPublica's seminars on conservative thinking, really, about how to tackle poverty, inequality, and some of the endemic problems that our country suffers from. This is the second in our panels, and we're very grateful to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation for supporting the event. What we're discussing today is really one of, the most fascinating areas, which is the penalty of place. And it's oft said, but it bears repetition, that your postcode of your birth, together with the level of your mother's education, is a pretty good approximation of what the Greeks used to call fate. And it is determinative of so many of your outcomes. If you're born on the wrong side of the tracks, if you're born in Blackpool versus being born in Richmond, leaving aside the economics, which I'm sure all of you are well aware of, you'll live 13 years longer in ill health, you'll die earlier, and all of these problems will more than likely be passed on to your children and your children's children. And what's happened, I think, in terms of place is that, for a variety of reasons that we can discuss, is place has, in a number of ways, morphed with class. And class, until relatively recently, was the great untalked about phenomenon in our country, and it's a tragedy for the country. The left that we have had stopped speaking about class and was instead become consumed in the various sectional politics, which bedeviled the United States and threatened to do the same to us. And I think this loss of class and the loss of a class-based analysis is an ongoing tragedy for this country, because what it does is it prevents us from tackling some of the perennial and ongoing problems. And if you look at the work of something like the Social Metrics Commission, what I think is remarkable is that they showed that over the past generation, those in deep poverty has increased by something like 1.5 million of our citizens. So something like just around 4.4 million of our citizens are defined as being in deep and persistent poverty. And what I think is interesting about place is that place is part of what confines and maintains this level of poverty. And interestingly enough, as Mike will shortly go on to talk about, some of those places that exact a penalty are in our richest city, in London. So the place penalty of certain specific locales in London are arguably as high, if not higher, than anything in the north. But of course, the issue about where you're placed is one of the interesting things that, if you look at school mobility, for instance, no one's been quite able to explain the London miracle. There's been multiple attempts to explain why London schools have done so well. But my colleague Mark Moran did some impromptu work which showed a pretty strong correlation between house price rises and the opting back in of middle-class parents into the state education system. And I suspect that that is the key factor behind London's rise. So the interesting thing about London is one might argue that the availability of responses is much closer. And after a good decade in British public policy, I think the single greatest thing we can do is mix the lives and fates of working class people with middle class people. I can't think of anything else that is likely to produce a better outcome. And everywhere that we at ResPublica have worked, and everywhere that I've worked personally, I just see segregation. And I see segregation on the level of class, and it's often around houses and schooling and access. And I think, therefore, it's to be hugely welcome that the Conservative Party now has an electorate whose areas are subject to these problems. So we have a chance of it being addressed. And this is our great hope for these series of panels, and we're enormously grateful for the MPs that are joining us to discuss this, as well, of course, as the academics, that hopefully what we're asking them to do is lay out the facts as they see them and some of the responses as they see them. But I think, as I argued in the earlier panel, one of the tragedies of modern conservatism is we don't think at scale for those who are below the median. You know, we have lots of interventions for the bottom 10%, which arguably make, absent perhaps the Troubled Families Initiative, arguably make very little difference. And we fetishize too much the bottom 10% as if those problems are only for them. And we fail to engage with, you know, the 40% above them, who are, I think, best characterized by the term insecurity, at risk of falling into poverty, at risk of falling behind along the multiple levels of health, opportunity. You care to name any outcome that you think as salutary and desired for yourself, and in those places where a place penalty is exacted, it will be less. Now, we've failed really to deal at scale with any of the issues around place. We at ResPublica wrote the first report on devolution called Devo Mank that I wrote with my colleague Mark. And absent that, we'd seem devoid in terms of place-based initiatives. I think the Towns Fund is very welcome. I think the Levelling Up Fund is very welcome. I think it's important that people see improvements in their areas, but none of these are likely to tip the scale or move the dial. We need something at scale. And as I argued in the other panel, if you look at what has actually helped those in the bottom 50%, if I can put it like that, are the great sort of regulatory measures like the minimum wage and the living wage has transformed the lives of working class people. Compulsory pensions enrollment and the triple pension lock has actually done an enormous amount to reduce pensioner poverty. Arguably, also Brexit has, for the first time, created a constriction in the labour supply for those at the lower skill and wage level that might well see, and indeed there's very strong evidence for that already, wages rise for those at the bottom. But absent that, our initiatives for people in the bottom half have been sorely lacking. We focus too much as conservatives or conservative thinkers on the minor, and we don't approach things at the major scale. Our policy is absent on issues of the family. Our policy, I would argue, is relatively absent on issues of place. What I also think compounds the problem is we fetishize the language of social mobility. And as such, we fail to see or talk about what happens to those who are left behind when we drive the children who are successful out of those areas that are unsuccessful. And the continuing penalty that is paid on those who are left behind because they're left behind. And I think we need to change the language. We've got to stop having a philosophy of escape, and we've got to have a philosophy of recovery of these areas and creating security and some genuine form of hope at every level for all of the outcomes that we're going to discuss. Anyway, I've probably spoken for too long, which I apologize for. I'm enormously grateful to David Simmonds MP and to Danny Kruger MP for joining us. I'm also immensely thankful to Mike Hawkins from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who's going to speak next, who's going to outline the trends about place, and then Professor Ruth Lupton, who's done also outstanding work, as has Mike, on the institutional difference between successful or privileged and unprivileged places, institutions, and public services. And what I'd hope to engender from this discussion is some ideas and policy ideas as to what could make a difference. After all, the Conservatives have a new electoral base, and they need to start serving that rather than ignoring it, and stop thinking in terms of policies for the successful and think of policies for those who have yet to be successful, but would very much like to be as well. So with no further ado, at exactly 2:10, so I'm very proud of myself, I'm going to turn to Mike. Mike, we're very grateful to you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Philip, and really great to be here. I've got a few slides to show, so I'm just going to share them with you. So my name's Mike Hawkins. I'm Head of Policy and Partnerships at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and a lot of my work is centred around place and poverty. So as Philip said, I'm going to touch a lot on the drivers and trends, but also come up with some ideas about what we think governments should be doing about this. The is that poverty exists in every corner of the UK, from our largest cities to our smallest villages. However, the scale and depth of poverty people experience really does differ. Household poverty rates, that's less than households living on less than 60% of median incomes, can only be calculated at a regional level due to data limitations. But after housing costs, as Philip mentioned earlier, London is the region with the highest poverty rate in the UK at 27%. Closely followed by the North East and the West Midlands. The map, though, looks at child poverty rates, which can get down to smaller local authority scales, and what that does is really show some of the differences within regions as well. The darker the colour on the map, it suggests where poverty rates are higher. In England, this measure generally shows that child poverty rates are generally highest in non-core city urban areas, so places like Oldham, Bradford, Sandwell. But that said, rates are also high in some more isolated and larger former industrial urban areas, particularly Middlesbrough, Stoke, Hull, those sorts of places. However, I should also say this: some of the inner London boroughs, particularly those in East London, have particularly high child poverty rates too. However, just looking at the rates can sometimes be misleading, and actually the numbers of children in poverty, and this is partly due to population sizes, really does show that it's London and the core cities where the most number of children are in poverty, in particular Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Glasgow and Sheffield. They're all within the sort of top 7 local authority areas for number of children in poverty. All this being said, that doesn't mean that poverty isn't a problem in rural and coastal areas. I think coastal communities in particular is a particular issue. In places like Blackpool and even in the southeast like Thanet, you find concentrations of poverty in places like that, sometimes driven by policy choices, but sometimes driven by housing markets as well. The picture is slightly different in Wales and Northern Ireland, where child poverty rates are much more prevalent in rural areas than they are in some of the urban areas as well. So what drives this difference? And we think that there's broadly 2 things, and this is in very broad terms, that drives the difference in relative income poverty in places. And this is essentially the relative strength of local labour markets, the amount of jobs in the place, the employment rates, the wages that are being paid, and the relative cost of housing. So if you look at some of the before housing costs rates of poverty, then Yorkshire and the Humber, the North East, Yorkshire and Humber and the West Midlands all have the highest poverty rates at about 21%. That's really demonstrating that actually the employment rates and median earnings are a specific problem in those areas. And prior to COVID-19, all of those regions had employment rates and median earnings that lagged the UK average. But London's really interesting because before housing costs, the poverty rate for London as a whole was 16% and actually below that of the average of the UK. It's after housing costs that London's poverty rate increases to 27%, which is significantly above the UK average of about 22%. So housing costs are a huge driver of poverty in London. Though clearly that doesn't mean that the labour market and jobs are not a problem there. It's just that housing, it causes such a significant issue for so many populations. I want to keep the focus though on labour markets in this presentation, because I think the place penalty is really quite significant when it comes to the labour market, the type and quality of jobs that are actually available and accessible because of where you live. And I think one of the things that's worth reflecting on is that prior to the pandemic, the UK had a really good story to tell on the labour market. We had record employment rates, but despite that, there were large parts of the country that were simply locked out of that prosperity that were enjoyed by many, and with employment rates way behind the national average. So while some parts of the UK had employment rates of 80% of the working age population in employment, those are sort of the lighter areas on this map. Others had less than 70% and lagged the UK median by as much as 10%. That's a massive gap in terms of the employment rates from the UK average. And I think what you can, there are specific concentrations where the employment rates were significantly lower than they should have been. So lower in coastal areas, in large parts of northern England, there's that big swathe of the country that essentially crosses the M62, the West Midlands, particularly in and around Birmingham, and also in parts of southern Wales and southern Scotland. But also, interestingly, there are some London boroughs where the employment rates were significantly lower than the UK average. But obviously, it's not just about the employment rates that matters. It's also about how much you earn. And one of the measures that we look at is lower quartile earnings across Britain. We've chosen that because it sort of generally gives a decent measure or a decent sense of the earnings of low-income families. And what that found is that there is some correlation, though weak, with the employment rate on this map. So there are places where you have quite low employment rates, but also very lower quartile earnings as well. And actually, we find that particularly in coastal areas in northern England and southern Scotland and Wales. So many of the areas that are really highlighted in this map suffer from both having lower employment ability for people to find a route out of poverty through work. COVID, of course, has had a massive impact on the labour market, but the place story of this is more complicated than it might seem. This map shows the changes to claimant unemployment between February 2020 and February 2021. Sadly, I haven't been able to update it since then. But although unemployment rates have increased everywhere, we've actually seen some of the largest increases in London and the larger cities and places that are in and around airports. Some coastal areas and some other parts of urban parts of northern England have seen steadier increases, but they were generally starting from a higher base anyway. So essentially adding to existing problems and challenges. And the thing is, what's really going on is that these are the places that have seen the highest increases in claimant employment are places where the employment rates were based upon, or the jobs that were available tended to be in hospitality, in retail, or their jobs were dependent upon lots of commuters or tourists coming into a place and sustaining jobs. And those are the things that still haven't quite yet come back. And I think that's something that we are particularly concerned about. So although policies like the furlough scheme have done a really good job at protecting those jobs, we're still slightly concerned to see how that might play out as our economy continues to open up over the next few months. I think the pandemic's effect on London is particularly stark, and we have concerns about how quickly that might recover. And although in theory London's economy may well come back quite quickly because of all the various different bits of economic advantages it has, if commuters or actually international tourism takes longer than we might expect, then actually some of the issues that we've seen caused by the pandemic may well be compounded. So different places have different needs, and one of the ways that we tend to like to think about different types of places is based on some work we did with Newcastle University, thinking about core cities, the principal city regions of a place, overshadowed places, so the neighbouring towns or cities to a core city, so places like Wakefield, Bolton and Wolverhampton, and freestanding places, so smaller towns and cities than core cities, but often some distance from them, so places like Hull, Blackpool and Grimsby. And whilst they might all have similarities, actually what this is talking about is that there are quite significant differences between them, and they all have different types of needs and different interventions required to really support their labour markets. Some of it might be to do with commuting and supporting better connections into a place where there is more employment. Others may require more fundamental reform and a challenge. Because where jobs are really do matter. And I think one of the things that we're keen to really highlight and remind government is that levelling up the UK cannot be successful without real investment in those core cities of Leeds and Manchester and Birmingham and the like. I think one of the things that one of the dangers of this sort of analysis, though, is that you might just assume that some of those overshadow places. I'm not a massive fan of that term, but it does get to a fundamental part of it. Is that it doesn't just mean that we're saying those places should become commuter towns to the larger cities. What's important is really important is to understand the differences between them and how the relationships work within the context of that local labour market and the role different places play. Some will be right for commuter town, right for commuting to the larger city, but others will actually become an economic destination in and of themselves. So what might bring good jobs to those places? There's no silver bullet, and this is often the challenge of this policy area. But the things that we suggest on screen are sort of part of the packages that we think might really be important. There isn't a whole amount of evidence, particularly for places that those more isolated places, around what type of interventions will really help to build and succeed a place. But when you start to look at it, it's a combination of some of the things that are on screen. Now, the government's actually trying many of these things, and Philip's already mentioned things like the Towns Fund and the Levelling Up Fund, and they will make some differences, often at a small scale. But actually, you need some more fundamental reforms, particularly to things like adult skills and education, to really ensure that some of the truly transformative challenges around levelling up can be achieved. I think one of the most important things, though, is actually something about the clear understanding of place and the role and identity that plays in economic in the future prospects of that place. And I think that is both based on a place level, but also on an individual level. So, for example, convincing a proud town with a rich history of employment and production that its prospects are strongly linked to the performance of the nearby town, who may well be actually a rival, is far from easy and presents a really big political challenge. But the key to that will be engaging meaningfully with citizens in that process to help redefine and revitalise. But similarly, on an individual level, growing up in a town or community where most people you know have previously found employment within that place is very different to growing up in a place where everyone around you has commuted to work elsewhere. That's not a problem of aspiration, as it's sometimes seen, but it's actually more about social capital, about connections, about the understanding of labour market opportunities and how they can be secured. And I think we need to think carefully about how we can support or how we can create interventions that can do this. So very quickly then, just finally, what do we think places need? And I think there are 5 things that are really quite important. So strong local institutions that are sustainable across political cycles to help lead some of this, lead some of the economic interventions that we really need. A shared sense of identity and purpose that citizens and businesses have bought into, that there's clear buy-in for. Secure and reliable funding. So although things like the Towns Fund and Levelling Up Fund are useful, they are short-term, they're competitive. And I think to really sustain a lasting difference in places, you need that like security. An ability to coordinate labour market demand and supply side policy at a local level, and fundamentally about that sort of economic development policy. And finally, improving the quality of existing jobs in places. So even though even in those places that are lagging, one of the reasons they are lacking is because of the quality of those existing jobs, particularly in things like social care, retail, and hospitality. If we can improve paying conditions in those jobs, then we will actually start to make a significant difference to the labour market opportunities that exist in those places. So I've gone slightly over. Apologies about that, but hopefully that's a quick run through of some of the issues that we think places face. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. I was very struck by your kind of account of what we need in terms of strong local institutions. But we remain a society and a country where we don't seem to be able to generate the powerful, transformative local institutions that other countries do. You know, even with devolution, which we at ResPublica have pushed very strongly, the powers that councils have are still very minimal. They have hardly any independent tax raising powers, where if you look at places that have turned around, they all have the ability to raise taxes independently. They've been cut during the Osborne years they bore the highest proportion of the cuts, so they have limited kind of capacity and function. So, I tend to agree that the most important element of the state is the local state, but it's a very emasculated, attenuated thing. And I wonder what sort of at-scale solution might meet the needs. So at the moment, we at ResPublica are working with Chris Skidmore MP on through a whole lifelong education commission, where we want to make retraining open to everybody, even those who've been burnt by school, burnt by education, as well as those who've been very successful. That's an at-scale response to the skills problem, and in every council we've worked, that's a key factor. What, in your mind, would be an at-scale response to the problem of relatively weak local institutions, which, if I added up all of your recommendations, that you're arguing for strong local institutions. So how do we get there?
So I think part of it is recognising that you wouldn't initially start from where we are, and I think that's probably the first thing. So I think you've got to build on what exists and what's already there, and I do think that the move to mayoral combined authorities provides the potential for that, particularly where they exist. And I think that's something that you can really build upon. That's something where you can start to build some of those local institutions. And if you take your skills example, I would really hope that you could build something at that labour market level to really ensure that you are starting to add on things. And what that means is that you would start to deliberately build and design national policy which worked at that scale as well. And I think too often in recent years, policy has tried to work against some of those institutions. So if you take education, for example, regional schools commissioners were deliberately designed on a footprint to not map existing devolution settlements, and I think that was very deliberate in its terms. I think if you were trying to build good, strong local institutions, you would ensure that national policy was designed around those things, and that means thinking about how you ensure that DWP services can work at that sort of scale, how you can make sure that DFE services can work at that scale, how you might start to think about even healthcare services at that sort of spatial scale as well, and you start to build things up quite quickly.
I'm a strong believer in that, and I always think the British Olympic team, with its notion of small marginal advantages that you add up, is really the answer. We need innovation across all of these different spectrums added up together in place, but the only thing that can deliver that is a local authority. There's now nothing else. I'll leave that aside. Let's go to Ruth, who has done much work, and thank you, Mike, most helpful, who has done much work on the relative difference between institutions and services. Ruth, over to you, and thank you.
You're welcome. It's great to be here. And as both you, Philip and Mike, have indicated, there's a massive areas, everything comes together in place. So I'm going to try and offer in as near as 10 minutes, I'd get it at a few provocations that might take us into a useful discussion. I don't want to spend too long on the problem, but I think it is worth restating just the scale of spatial inequalities that we have in this country. And I've just cited some of the key figures here: 19-year gap in healthy life expectancy between the most and least deprived areas, concentrations of poverty, 25% of the poorest children in the 10% most deprived local authority areas, and so on. And here at the bottom, some more neighbourhood statistics, the differences in child obesity rates, in achievements at educational achievements at age 19, and so on. And also to point out that these patterns are really incredibly long established. I mean, the pattern of poverty is broadly the one established by the Industrial Revolution, although we do see ups and downs over periods of 10, 15, 20 years. So, one of those was the creation of outer city overspill estates between the wars, and particularly after the wars, that created areas of low-cost housing, which were then affected by industrial decline. More recently, we've seen that what's often described as a suburbanization of poverty, as the new economic geographies favoured central city areas and less so outer areas and smaller towns. Mike's already talked about the recent decline of coastal towns and so on. So there are those trends. And if we look at both at regional economic gaps and at gaps in social indicators, health, poverty, education, and so on, there's no doubt that those gaps have been widening over the last 2 decades, and particularly between the London and the southeast and the north. And the UK is generally known to be one of the most regionally unequal countries of our economic competitors. Neighbourhood level gaps are more complicated to analyse, but in broad terms, we haven't been seeing any substantial reduction in gaps. And as Mike pointed out, we can expect these to be worse. So we've got long-standing, variable patterns, but long-standing and deep. I wanted just to talk a little bit about what causes those. I'm drawing here on some work I did with Anne Power over 20 years ago, where we argued that place characteristics are fundamentally driven by, hard but not all impossible to change structural characteristics, geographic and economic, and that those shape over time who lives and works there, so that the least advantaged people become concentrated in the least advantaged places. And those two things then shape the environmental, social, regional and relational characteristics of the place. And there's a rather inadequate diagram that tries to explain this, with the housing, the geographical, the economic, structural things at the top, driving residential composition, and then the meaning of that place and its social infrastructure and relationships, but all set in the wider macroeconomic, demographic, migration, and wider policy context. One of the reasons why this diagram is inadequate is that we really struggled to know what to call these hard to change purple characteristics. We started off calling them intrinsic characteristics. They're obviously not. Where the location is obviously intrinsic, but the economy isn't. But the point is, these are ones at the top are really things that take long-term, they take a long time to change the economic character of a place. And I think that this speaks to some of the reasons why we failed in policies, that we expect shorter term changes in what are inherently long-term characteristics. So that takes me to conclude that we always need place-based policies as well as people-based ones, and that we always need to think about the wider spatial context, because some of the things on that diagram operate at the very micro-local level, some of them are regional, some of them are national, some of them are global, some of them are sub-regional. And that we need to work all the time, both on the things that Mike talked about, housing and labour market characteristics of connectivity, but also on those what we call acquired characteristics, the social interactions and identity of the places themselves, and the services and the values and so on. And I wanted to touch a little bit more on those, to complement what Mike said about housing and labour market issues. Drawing on my research and low income neighbourhoods and areas of economic decline, some of these are some of the things that start to happen over a period of time. You have depleted household and community resources. Households don't have money to spend, so there's less access to privately provided services like transport, shops, cafes, etc. Public services are also under pressure, more pressure, both through because demand is great, but also jobs are hard. I've done a lot of work in schools in low-income areas, indicating how tougher it is to work in those kinds of places as a teacher or school leader. There are fewer incentives to work in those places, and there are bigger risks of getting it wrong. So we have problems with recruitment and retention and professional development. We see low private investment because there are low perceived returns in investment in these kind of areas, weaker infrastructure, constant pressures on the physical fabric, so higher maintenance costs for housing and the environment, depleted human capital, both skills and knowledge, but also health. Lower capacity in the voluntary and community sector, although there's often high social capital. And as I think Mike or Philip, you alluded to, depleted hope and expectations and depleted trust in institutions to deliver change. So we make it a lot, as these changes sort of accumulate, we're making it harder for people in the poorest places to change their own lives and to live the lives that they want to lead and lift themselves out of poverty. A little bit on what's been tried. No shortage of the sort of efforts over time, but these are the sorts of things that we've tried. Over the years, we've had multiple neighbourhood-based initiatives, the single regeneration budget, city challenge, the New Deal for Communities, housing market renewal, and so on and so on. And it's often said that these didn't work. I really want to counter that. Almost all the evaluations of these things showed that they worked in their own terms. They improved services, they helped residents to get into jobs, they improved educational outcomes or improvements in health on a certain scale. But it's clear that they couldn't be transformative in the absence of larger scale rebalancing. So more was expected of them than they could ever realistically deliver, and so they were dumped. Also, there are far too few of them, and they're far too short in time. We've had efforts, but no consistent efforts at regional and sub-regional rebalancing. We mustn't forget the bending of mainstream funding to schools and health funding according to need, which has to be there, but it's insufficient, always insufficient, and it's also inconsistent between policy areas, the ways in which we distribute funds to poorer areas. And I say it lacks a place-based dimension to supplement an individual focus. So, for example, in 2010-11, the government dropped the place-based initiatives in education to move to the pupil premium, which is entirely individual. I think we actually need both. Devolution, I think, is very promising, but it's very limited to date and in the powers that have been spent and also the geographies of it. And also we've seen various civil society initiatives, the big societies, but again on a very, very limited scale, and not enough to offset the wider pressures on the sector. So why these things have failed, I think, to sum this up, and echoing some of what you said, Philip, we've failed to understand and respond to the uneven pattern of the last economic transition, and also to manage the social costs of that. If we can't transform places, we need to recognise that there are long-term costs of decline, and to avoid those spiralling, that it is more costly to manage those. Secondly, we've had sustained inattention to the emerging problem of spatial inequality. We haven't noticed, most of the time there's been a lack of any monitoring of the situation or any cross-Whitehall responsibilities, with the exception of when we had the social exclusion unit and neighbourhood renewal unit in the early 2000s, but even then they were a neighbourhood scale rather than a broader scale. We had disconnection between action at the different scales, which are showed on the slide before. We expected short-term solutions to long-term problems. And we've gone for initiatives rather than mainstream structures, with a huge instability in policy, institutions and funding. Under each regime, we've got a different set of institutions. We dump the regional development agencies, we create local economic partnerships and so on. So different scales, different actors, different institutions. And we give insufficient attention to the problems caused by the fact that the problems have developed over 30, 40 years. So I just to finish with a few future policy directions. I think these were said by Mike. We need large-scale, long-term levelling up, both physical and social infrastructure investment. There's no real way getting around that, I don't think. And we need to have a long-term and stable policy architecture for doing this, not chopping and changing with every government. Critically, I think we need to be able to de-silo governance, accountabilities and funding. We need to be able to integrate economic and social policy in the same places. And we also need, even without the economic element, we need to be able to be more imaginative in social policy integration. For example, can we use health money to support reskilling? Because that would have massive benefits to people's health. We need to strengthen civil society institutions, and that I think means sustained funding, and also countering some of the upscaling that's gone on. So giving more support to very small and community-based organisations close to the ground. We need to be able to more effectively channel private investment, social impact bonds, local banks. I wonder what can be done about de-risking of initiatives in local areas, some kind of local insurance schemes, not a well thought through proposal, place-based foundations, marshalling of pro bono work, etc. And also much more attention to the spatial differences in public services, quality schools, GP services, hospitals, etc. So you make sure you're not getting worse services because you live in poorer places, which is happening now. And I've put a few ideas about how those might be done, which I'm happy to unpack later, but I'm sure I've gone on far too long, so I'm going to stop.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That's fascinating. What I think is interesting, and in a way it's the same version of the question I posed Mike, is when you looked at the neighbourhood renewal type project, you said actually they did work, but they suffered from a lack of a wider scale initiative. And I suppose what I would ask is, what is that wider scale initiative? I mean, I'm in complete agreement with you. My hope is over time, devolution becomes the stable architecture, but we still haven't devolved anything of any real seriousness. And I also agree with you that on the local level, we need to give local government, and perhaps David will speak about this, local government the power to spend as it sees fit, because you're quite right. Employment is the best health proxy. So getting people into employment might be the best use of health monies. And it is true that our siloed government at the national level results in fragmented governance at the local level. But what interests me is, what can we do at the grand scale? Because if you look at the North, for instance, the North is really still suffering from the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, which was a low-skill revolution that drew all the low-skilled of the country as it was then. They came in vast numbers from Ireland, pushed out all of the diverse skills down to the southeast, and we're living with the legacy of a low-skill industrial revolution. So if that's the really long term for the North, and I've written about this and I've argued that's why we need investment in human capital, what's the big answer to that? So, think broadly, like, what is a big answer? I've argued elsewhere for different corporate tax rates in the North, different income tax rates. What would be the innovation you would favour most?
Yeah, I'm not a regional economist, so I can't answer that last question about corporate tax rates and so on, what to do about the economy of the North. But it's clear that we could make more effort to ensure that places in the North were better placed to respond to new economic opportunities, advanced manufacturing, health and care services, green jobs and so on, and that also needs to be supported by a major rebalancing of the infrastructure. Everyone who comes to the North is so shocked by our little trains, for example, and our fragmented public transport systems, and our depleted and empty urban environments. So that and some of that making places better to live in will support movement and building of a rebalancing of human capital, which will enable the North to be a better place for those opportunities. So, but I think the key thing that I was trying to say, in relation to the neighbourhood initiatives, that those large-scale regional economic strategies have to be fed down and integrated with the more micro-local and social policy initiatives that are happening at the local authority and neighbourhood scale and planned on a long term. And that's what we've never done, and we're still not doing that. So if we're taking an area, for example, where we're building advanced manufacturing clusters, we need to put all the things in place there: community wealth building, skills training, health support, early years, strengthening. We have to put it all in place at the same time in the same places.
Very, very learned, and I'm afraid I'm in violent agreement with you, Ruth. Apologies. Let me now turn. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Ruth. We've had quite an exhaustive account, but I think it's sustaining. I think there's a very coherent vision there of what places need. So I'm great pleasure that we welcome David Simmonds MP. MP for Ruslip, Northwood and Pinner, who's going to speak on the role of local authorities and what they can indeed do. So David, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being interested. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Philip. Pleasure to join you. And it's very interesting listening to the presentation so far. Posed a lot of really good questions, both for government centrally and also local government. Perhaps the starting point, somebody who spent more than 20 years of my life in various different roles in local authorities. We should reflect on the fact that we look at the European Charter of Local Self-Government, which is the gold standard by which we identify things like the level of autonomy and devolution that are present in a country, that the UK does fall very significantly behind many of our comparable countries, both in Europe and across the world. So local authorities in the UK have much less power and autonomy than comparable places. And a particularly interesting example is probably Germany, where you have a structure of government that was designed by British local government experts to be the most optimal structure, one which is well regarded as having contributed significantly to stability and social progress and economic development over the years. And we have to ask ourselves the question, why is it that we in the UK have been reluctant to go down that particular route? Now, a lot of the questions that go to the heart of poverty do touch on the issue of class. And clearly there are factors present in the UK which are unusual in that respect. We have, for example, a very large private sector in education by comparison with most other countries. Around 7% of children in Britain go to a private educational setting, where it's less than 1% in most of the rest of the comparable nations. And we have local politics that tend to be very much run in sync with national politics. And kind of this poses a number of questions about what it is that we would want local authorities to do, and why is it that we might want them to do it. So why, for example, have we had a policy where the view has been that local authorities should not be part of improvement in education, that it's only trusts, not-for-profit organisations, but it shouldn't be anybody who is accountable to local people that has that role. Why is it, for example, that in the UK, local authorities don't have the kind of role that you see in most of the rest of the world in running local health services? So I think starting, I guess, is the question, what do we mean by long-term? And when we consider most of the things like the single regeneration budget, the timescale on which we measure those things is extremely short. And it's not surprising that the impact that state intervention has in a given area, whether it's advanced manufacturing, whether it's the creation of a university, often takes decades to filter through into the lives of people in that area. So it is not something which is likely to be measured against targets set on a 2 or 3 or 5 year timescale. So detaching that from a national cycle of political elections clearly is going to be important if we're going to enable some of those projects to be measured in a meaningful way. And one of the characteristics of local authorities is that although the local politics may change, you can build a degree of consensus about what your long-term ambition is for that local community. And if I look at the London Borough of Hillingdon, where I've been a councillor for a long time, Brunel University, which came to Uxbridge, the main town of Hillingdon, in the 1960s, it's probably taken 25, 30 years to really change the dynamics of the neighborhood in which it is located. But it has changed it for the better, and it's brought in prosperity and development in an area that was in decline because of the decline of manufacturing in particular, that had previously been the economic mainstay of that particular part of the borough. So I think we need to be thinking about what we mean in the context of timescales, medium and long term, being having a plan for where we want to be in 25, 30, 40 years. The second challenge, I think, is how courageous we want to be in making changes that will be meaningful in people's lives. And we've talked quite a lot about education, and one of the classic features of the education system in England has been that high-performing schools are found in a very, very patchy distribution across the country, and that we know that selection is a big factor in the performance of schools. The more selective the school is, the better the outcomes tend to be. And that's true across the state sector as well as the private sector. So at one end of the scale, you've got the top end private schools where you have to pass an entrance exam to get in to prove you're already in probably the top 1% of the country academically, and you have to have a family able to put £45,000 a year out of their taxed income behind your education. But even in areas where you don't see access to that kind of education, we know that schools that have criteria such as faith or specialism in a subject, those schools tend to outperform the peers that have a genuinely comprehensive intake. And probably the most significant attempt to address this was Brighton City Council, who implemented a lottery system for school admissions, seeking to address both the class factor, recognising that being in the company of highly motivated children with supportive parents was probably the biggest difference that could be made for the lives of children from disadvantaged backgrounds. But the key thing about that was it was enormously unpopular with parents in Brighton who felt that they paid sometimes millions of pounds to have a house in a particular street to get their child into a highly favoured state school, who were then told a lottery system was going to send them to the other end of the city. So introducing things that have that revolutionary impact is often an enormous challenge at a local level. But we do clearly have to confront some of these uncomfortable truths, and we need to recognise that the impact is hugely variable locally. So we look at London, even before the London challenge to raise educational standards in schools, those standards were rising, and a lot of that was due to an ethnic factor, that highly motivated children from ethnic minority backgrounds were accelerating away from their white, British, poor peers who were in the majority of the population, and that was a big factor in driving standards in schools. And we still see that difference across the country. And we need to recognise even within those factors, there are nuances. So we know, for example, that children from an Indian background, Indian heritage background, tend to do very well in education from the start of school right through to university, whereas children from a Pakistani, Bangladeshi background seem to be disadvantaged. So we need to recognise that there is no one size fits all. So where does this take us? I think the key characteristic that as a national politician I'd be looking for in our response is that it needs to command public confidence, that people in an area on the receiving end of any intervention need to be able to see the difference that it is making in their community. And when we reflect on previous attempts to address poverty, probably the most significant was the focus on the 60% or less of median income. Those measures were only successful when the national financial crash reduced national incomes on average. So people who were on a fixed benefit income found themselves being moved from one side of the poverty line to the other. But it made no material difference. It didn't result in any change in their day-to-day lives at all. And we need to reflect when the place I grew up, South Wales, was significantly impacted by deindustrialisation. The European Union, EEC as it then was, invested huge amounts of money, in particular to transport infrastructure, to open up access from places that had lost long-established industries to create job opportunities for people in different areas by enabling them to commute. And those areas were the ones most likely to vote to leave the European Union, to effectively reject the intervention which had been put in by well-meaning institutions to try and improve people's lives and to say, this is not what we want. So we need to think about what is it that commands public confidence. So what are the things that we need to do that introduce a short-term improvement, something people can see, including people who we're not directly targeting, but who have an interest in that community. And then what are the things that we do, the measures that we have in place that are about the longer term change over a much more significant timescale that we need to achieve. And I think if we can do those things, so we build the public confidence at the start with visible change, high profile projects that people see making a difference, and we match that with a much longer term view of where all of this is intended to take us strategically, then we will command that public confidence, and we have a chance of levelling up, making a sustained difference to the quality of lives of people in many parts of our country.
Thank you, David. A really fascinating 10 minutes there. I enjoyed all of your points. The thing that stays with me is one of your first points, which is about, can we localize a long-term plan? I think that's very visionary. And I just wonder, you know, we're talking about how local authorities are versus how they could be. So what sort of what would local authorities have to be like in order to engender that type of long-term localization versus what they are now? And how would that survive the changes of party and governance, etc.?
So in my view, it requires a change in our national mindset about what the purpose of a local authority is, away from being a service provider there to deliver what central government determines, to being the government, the advocate for the area that it represents. And I'm very struck when I visited, for example, Ludwigsburg in Germany, which is the twin town of the town in South Wales that I grew up in, that the municipal authority is also a major provider of banking. It's a major investor in local businesses. So over the various economic cycles, the local authority uses its leverage, its role as an economic a player in that area to ensure that businesses are sustained, are invested in, and that in turn supports the development of jobs. It's a significant factor, not just a spectator, but a part of the local university and the local educational scene. So it's able to take a long-term view of what it's seeking to achieve in the interests of its local area. And I think if we look at what's happening in the UK, we tend to have a narrative that flows in the opposite direction. And that's particularly maybe stark in respect to something like property. Now, throughout much of Europe, and Switzerland's probably the best example, most local authorities finance a large part of their activity by being very significant owners of residential property. And that isn't just for people who are in need. So they're not simply there as a provider of last resort. They are there as a significant landowner. And that means that they are able to use the revenues that they generate from that, both to ensure that the quality of the housing is very good, but also that it creates surpluses which can be invested into other things like health services, roads, and infrastructure, all of which contributes to people's quality of life. And because they have that level of independence as economic players in their own right, they're not simply there saying, on one hand, to central government, what are you going to give us to do the things that you're saying that we have to do? And to the community, well, I'm sorry, we can only do this much to help you because government keeps us on a short leash. We need to have a different, much more autonomous vision where, frankly, the local council becomes the government for its area and is able to do what it is that that community needs over the long term.
David, this is very, I'm really excited by this idea. I think it speaks to what Ruth spoke about strong institutions, and Mike as well. And I think that what you're describing there is the local state as the entrepreneurial state, and I think that we in, those of a conservative mindset have essentially made, still keeping with the 1980s model that government can't do anything entrepreneurial. I think this is profoundly wrong when you look at anywhere else in the world. Government was the first investor in Silicon Valley, for example. But I would love to pursue this idea at greater length with you, both in your article for the book, which I think this would be a suitable subject for, and outside of these seminars as we seek to extend it. Thank you, a fascinating presentation. Now we turn to Danny Kruger MP, philosopher, thinker, worked in inner London charity for many years, trying to tackle knife crime and general alienation of urban youth. So Danny, it's a great pleasure to welcome you, to have you on this ResPublica seminar. And you, like I, were a great early supporter of civil society and and big society, and you've maintained that interest. And I think you're going to speak along the lines of what a renewal of some of our local institutions might look like.
Thanks, Philip. Well, always good to do anything with you, and particularly with the JRF as well. And it just feels like we're part of a really significant realignment in politics and in social policy and in economic thinking that you've championed, Philip, and the sort of this alignment with the JRF, I think, is important. And I hope that my party will be coming along on that journey, as we are in many ways. And I think what we're trying to do here, what I'm trying to do, is push us further down the track towards along the agenda that's been described and discussed today. So, there's so much richness that's been spoken of already, and I mean, I agree with everything. I was struck by something that Paul Collier wrote recently, to the effect that polling shows something quite remarkable, which is that for all of our divisions as a society and all our disagreements, there's a remarkable degree of unanimity about what the great social challenge facing our country is, and it's spatial inequality, which Paul describes as a surprise because it's something he's been going on about for years, as have others in this group. But it wasn't something that I think many people expected the public as a whole to prioritise as well. But actually, if you think about it, of course, this is what matters. And I think our politics and our tumultuous electoral politics of recent years demonstrates that that is indeed what concerns people. So I agree with the list that Mike put out earlier about the priorities for places, what places need, how we're going to improve spatial inequality by investing in the leadership, the skills, social capital of places. I also think we need a great redistribution of power in our country. I mean, I echo David's point just now about the need for greater local autonomy of local government, but we need to go further than that. We need devolution beyond the town hall, and we need to explore options for a much more participatory way of doing politics and doing local decision making than just, quadrennial elections or whatever it is. So we need to engage the public much more fruitfully and meaningfully in local decision making. And that said, I've got my own idea, which I haven't asked anyone about. So this isn't me reflecting what I think the public want, but I suspect there'd be some popularity for this. And it is about institution building. And I think we focus too much, and I think the government focuses too much on what we might call the infrastructure of access. So how do you get in and out of places? And ideas in and out of places and information. So it's all about broadband and trains so the infrastructure of access and some about skills as well, which can be, if we're not careful, interpreted as just another means of giving people the opportunity to get out. So all of that's important. We do need this infrastructure of access. We need people and things and goods and information and ideas to flow as seamlessly as possible in and out of places. And I mean, I represent a rural constituency in the southwest, which depends. The future of Wiltshire is in broadband and improved rural transport, because our villages are going to die if people can't get in and out of them and can't work from them. And the opportunity to revive those places and frankly undo what Philip was talking about, the drain to the towns in the Industrial Revolution, to restore villages and towns, market towns, as viable centres of economic life in this country, which is what we need. That does depend on infrastructure of access. But there is, I think, frankly, a more profound need, which is infrastructure of place. And what I would like to see in our time is a new movement of infrastructure, of institution building, as we saw in the Victorian era. And with that, I want to echo a particularly Victorian institution, which I think we need an old new reincarnation of, which is the library. And I think the local library could and should be the sort of totemic institution of the 21st century, because it has all of the qualities that we need. It's both inward looking and outward looking as an institution. It's the depository of local history, of local memory. It's where you literally have the records of a place. and a place is nothing without its history, and we need to preserve that and honour it and give people access to it. And there's so many brilliant innovative projects recording local history, oral history, and so on that can be done through local libraries. I think they should be the home of local radio and local media as well. I think there's really interesting opportunities there that the BBC are actually engaged with in making libraries places of local media. So they look inwards and they remind us about the places that we belong to, but they're also outward looking. And this was the great movement of the Victorian Library movement, was to give people a window onto the outer world, of course through literacy in those days, and they remain vital for that purpose. And literacy remains a great challenge, particularly adult literacy in our country. So we need to recover that traditional idea of the value of libraries. But they also, of course, in the modern age, the opportunity to be a window to the world in a digital sense. And then finally, they create the skills. They can be the places where people gain the skills for mobility, and that mobility can be to elsewhere, as well as in place. So social mobility within place, or social mobility that can be accessed by geographic mobility. And what we hope, of course, is that lots of people go away and return, rather than go away and never come back. So libraries stand for both place and mobility. I mean, I share with Philip an anxiety, regret about the narrative of mobility as the only good, this individualized notion of progress and success. But obviously we do need mobility, and libraries are an agency for that. They also can and should be places of adult education. And I think there's the great skills revolution that's so desperately needed, and FE, I think, could be partnering with local libraries much more successfully. And then lastly, they are, and could and should be, and in many places already are, the place where we overcome the digital divide in our country, which is so profound. 9 million people not on the internet. Many of them don't want to be, and good for them. But many of them would greatly benefit from having digital skills. And we need to find a network of institutions that exist in bricks and mortar, with human beings of flesh and blood in them, who can help get people online and to navigate the new age. And there are some brilliant organizations like Good Things Foundation, which do exactly that, working through local libraries to improve digital inclusion. So I think there is an enormous opportunity. And actually, I said lastly now, is the role of business and of enterprise that libraries can represent, and particularly commend what the British Library are doing in that space. So they have a network of intellectual property centres, mostly in the big city libraries, but trying to create these as hubs for local libraries as well, to be the places where people with business ideas or needing to understand how the mechanics of starting a business can get the support they need. So they could be driving the local economy directly in that way. So then the question is, how do we achieve a new movement of library building or of library saving? Of course, many libraries exist and are under threat. And the question then is, kind of, what sector do they properly belong to? What is the agency or the bit of society that is going to take responsibility for them? And of course, the answer is all sectors. So there is a real role for the private sector in supporting libraries. I'm not averse to big tech having a role in this. Having tried that idea out on lots of sort of library types, they tend to not like the idea of Google or Amazon being plastered across the front of their library. And I get that, particularly if we're talking about data and digital literacy and inclusion and data ownership, and all these important ethical and commercial questions arise. But I think there might well be a role, even if it's just frankly asking them for money to support the local library network. But certainly the wider business community can and should be central to saving and promoting libraries, not least because they're going to get so many more, they're drivers of economic growth and skills locally. There is a big role for the public sector. I recognise that many public libraries do amazing jobs. There's a confusion in government about where library policy sits. It's a responsibility on the Department for Local Government, MHCLG, to support the library network, but DCMS, the Culture Department, oversees that statutory responsibility, and neither of them have much money for libraries. So I'd like to see more central government support and enhancing the local government role. But I think, thirdly, the role of civil society, and echoing what Ruth was just saying, communities create their own institutions. That's what happened in the Victorian age. The role of philanthropy, of self-help, trade unions, the municipal corporation in creating this movement. I think we need a revival of that. There are already 20% of libraries are community-led, and that I think should increase. I love there's so many brilliant innovations going on, often in wealthier places. Cambridgeshire, Suffolk, Devon, I think of have some really brilliant. The local authority is in really supporting community-led libraries, and that's feels like the right partnership to me. I'd like to see that spread, and what can we do to bring that into the less affluent areas? And so I will end with this. I think we need to ensure that levelling up funding and policy supports libraries and all the other local civil society institutions that we need. So that means the Levelling Up Fund needs to think about social infrastructure as well as more traditional economic infrastructure. There needs to be revenue funding because libraries don't run themselves, as well as capital. And I think we need to think more imaginatively about sources of money like the dormant assets, billions of pounds of money coming down the pipe that belongs to civil society or belongs to private sector that's making it available to communities. And I think we should use that money for purposes like this. That's it from me, Philip.
I'm very excited by your ideas, Danny. Two aspects. One, the commission that I've already mentioned, they're working with Chris Skidmore on. It's going very well. We've had lots of institutions join us, but I think libraries are a missing element of it. And I'd love to work with you, perhaps within this project and within that project, on a specific new modernized role for libraries, because we're arguing for a complete renewal of our skills-based system that focuses not just on qualifications as the government white paper advances, but skill and skill acquisition. And libraries are the obvious locale for that. But another locale that's really important is careers advice. And once you leave, higher end universities, you don't get any career advice anywhere about anything. And given that we're in an era of such rapid change, and given that people rightly will soon have opportunities to retrain, another addition to the library role might be the mapping of the future, economic future in the area, together with the ability and aspirations of the person in front. And I think if we could locate skills advice and career advice in libraries, so it's not just for those at Job Centre Plus, because if you're unemployed, you get very good advice often from Job Centre Plus. But for those who are in work or don't go into the Job Centre, that's a huge gap that I think libraries could fill. And I suppose I don't have a question for you because I agree with it, but I'm excited by your idea. So I'd love to work with you on that and kind of update libraries for the 21st century. So I'll be in touch with you.
Great. The other person who's doing some really good thinking on this is William Seacard, who's a advisor to government and has done a lot of thinking around libraries. And I completely echo. I should have made your point. I totally agree. The opportunity for really good careers advice linked into the local employers is totally right. And lastly, I didn't mention either heritage and architecture and the sort of the building of place feels really crucial. What I would not like to see is a new series of sort of glass and steel spaceships landing in our market towns. We've got to. This needs to be part of the reinvention of place. And I think there are already opportunities. I mean, Historic England are working with Library Network to position new libraries in old buildings, which feels like the right balance. So I just love the kind of old new element to this agenda, and I think we can tap into this romanticism of your agenda, Philip, while also modernising in a way that's going to work for the Treasury.
Yeah, if you look at the Louvre, they've got something highly modern erupting within an 18th century. Yes. So there's a sense in which I agree with that. But look, let's turn now to some questions. I do apologise to the participants if we haven't had time. But Mike, could we go to the first question? What I'd like to ask you to do is turn on your mic, just ask your question. I'd like to do 4 questions. No, actually, I'd like to do all of the questions, and then I'd like the panel to choose which question to respond. to. And that would be, I think, a lovely way to end the session. So, Mike, can you put forward the first question, please, that I've indicated?
Yeah, the first question comes from Donna McLaughlin.
Can you put her up? Is she with us?
Hello, it's Donna here. My question was about the power of anchor institutions. So thinking about the NHS, FE, colleges, even down at community-based organisations, how can they be used to connect and keep wealth to place?
I think it's an excellent question. Thank you, Donna, especially in places where the public sector is the dominant economic actor. So let's go to Jeff. And as I said to you, Jeff, just choose one of your 3 very good questions, please. And do turn on the video. You don't have to, but do if you would.
Philip, apologies. Video is not available for participants, just for panelists, but a microphone can be used.
Okay, Jeff, over to you.
Okay, I guess the one I'm going to choose is, should public service servant salaries be restructured to include elements of bonus based on GDP, equality and health, etc.? I guess get fed up with report after report and little slow action. And if some salaries were reduced and only topped up with performance bonuses, it might make the action actually happen.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And now Ying Jin, please.
Oh, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, brilliantly.
Yeah, well, thank you. And a very brief question, but I'd like to hear from all the panel, because I think in your lectures you said that all these deprived places are losing capable young people. So where are you going to get enough young people of that quality to support your initiatives?
Very good question again. Thank you. And Niall Goosegun, please.
Niall is not on anymore, so we will go to George Hosking if he's in.
I'll ask Niall's question because I think it's interesting. What opportunities does the upcoming Health and Social Care Integration Bill offer to strengthen local authority roles? And that speaks to David's point earlier. Okay, George. George Hoskins, please.
George, you're on the panel now. Maybe you need to unmute yourself, please.
George, unmute yourself if you would.
Yes, hi.
Ask your question, please.
Right. Looking at what drives poverty, James Heckman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, has done a lot of work on this. And his basic conclusion is that it's not poverty that drives poverty, but lack of skills in very young children. Lack of skills when they arrive at school in such things as emotional self-regulation, perseverance, ability to pay attention, ability to engage with authority figures. Andrea Ledsam's recent early years review recommends making the policies of the first 1,001 days a priority at both national and at local government level. Do you agree that this is a critical part of a long-term solution to tackling poverty in this country?
Well, these are lovely questions. Thank you. Paul, sorry, you don't quite have time for this, but if I could sum it up, Paul was asking you, Mike, how on earth we can address London's housing problems, but I suspect that COVID has helped in that regard, but let's leave that there for now. So I'd like to go MP, academic MP, academic MP. So Ruth, would you care to answer, one or two of the questions that our participants asked? You need to unmute yourself, Ruth.
Thanks. I'll take George's question about early years and also there was another one I was going to talk. I'll come to that in a second. So early years, so yes, yes and no. George, the yes is obviously the early years are absolutely crucial in terms of reduction of child poverty, creation of social mobility, or future educational life and life chances and so on. The no is that we can in danger of over emphasizing the early years. Data also shows that educational inequalities widen through the school years. So we can't see it as all being sorted in the early years. And so this does come to questions of school funding, accountabilities, curriculum, etc. And my other no there is that the focus that we've had on the early years to date has taken us in the direction of focusing on almost on attainment standards, English and English particularly early reading in the early years, and that's producing a narrowing of curriculum and practices like ability grouping, even among 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, which is actually shutting out those skills of communication, self-regulation, relationship building, and so on, exactly the ones that you highlight there. So I think it's really important, but we need to think about the way that it's done. I'd like to come back to anchor institutions, but I think anti-young people, but I think perhaps go somewhere else and see how we go for time, Philip.
You've got a minute. Go ahead, Ruth.
Okay, so anchor institutions, massively important part of the picture in terms of use of their assets, procurement, also their core businesses. The university role is really untapped in terms of links with further education, community education, skill development, and so on. And I think it was coming to a point that David made, about what commands public confidence. There's more. Those aren't always the huge things, the big economic developments. They're also the capacity for people to change the area that they live in themselves. And I think we've seen some really good examples from the United States of the way that anchor institutions have done sort of active market making for the provision of their services. So for example, universities and hospitals looking for laundry businesses or printing services, they've actually gone out and helped build community-based organizations, employee-owned or businesses that would be able to deliver those services, and supported the skill development around those, and those give people confidence that their area is going to change, but also they've got a part in transforming that area themselves. So yeah, a really big area to promote, I think.
Back in 2010. So I mean, I agree with you. David, would you like to respond to any of the questions?
Yes, so George won't be surprised to hear me say I agree entirely. I know I've been involved in the periphery, but with the Leadsom review. And
put your video on, David.
I said George won't be surprised to hear me say that I agree with the point about the first 1001 days, and that to me is an example of the very long-term thinking that I was referring to. There was a question about why are people not talking more about business and institutions. Like, one of the things that's characteristic of local government in particular is that it's able to take a much more long-term view in commercial and financial terms. And some people may have seen the evidence Francis Maud was giving about the role of supply chain finance and green steel capital in the context of government. And he said, well, the thing for government is nobody can provide this finance more cheaply than government can. So it is always in the interest of government to play that economic role. And if we look at many things that local authorities do in terms of their land holdings, their ability to manage their own treasury arrangements, it isn't a problem to take 40, 50, even 100, 150-year view about the return on an investment, whereas a business is often looking at a horizon of 1 or 2 years for profitability. Even something like a commercial mortgage is unlikely to be more than 10 years. So the ability to in effect accept a lower immediate return on investment in the interest of longer term benefit for that community is something which governmental players can do, but others simply can't. And just finally, the other question addresses the point about Angus and Jin about young people, where are they going to come from? One of the things that's characteristic about the housing market in London is it is driven by huge demand from people like myself who moved from other parts of the country here for opportunities. And the thing that will change that is ensuring that there are more opportunities in other parts of the country. So it has a beneficial effect for my constituents who are very concerned about overdevelopment, about seemingly endless demand for new property encroaching upon existing communities that they quite like the way they are. And it also has the benefit of ensuring that if you are a young person who can be a driver of that economic development in Middlesbrough, in Newport, in Strabane, or wherever it may be, that you don't have to move to London to get your start in life. You've got those opportunities closer to home.
Thank you so much, David. Really fascinating stuff again on reinventing the local authority, and love to work with you on that. Mike, if you could be quick though, just so I'd like to end on time, take a question if you would.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to build on what David was saying there, because I think in terms of young people and retaining those people locally, I think it is down to the education system and the strength of the local economies. And David's exactly right. If you had a stronger Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham, more people would stay and choose to live in those areas. But also crucially, the second half of it is that the reason young people move away is because in order to go to university, you tend to go away from where you are living. And the people who are left tend to then stay locally and go through to further education, into technical education. If we are going to invest more in technical skills and in that technical education, that's more likely to produce more skilled people locally who stay within their local areas, but also then help to hopefully, if it's well designed and done with businesses and with the right economic development strategies, you can help to attract businesses who require those technical skills to those places where people are being trained and developed. So I think it can be both a sort of a driver of skills, but also a driver of economic activity within the place as well.
Thank you very much, Mike. Danny, you have the last word.
Okay, brilliant. Quickly then, so I was interested in the question about health and local authorities. I think the health bill is a really significant opportunity. You know, the government's talking about integrated care, and that's totally what we need. We know how dysfunctional health and care is because of the silos. But it's not local authorities that need to be connected. And what I worry about for the bill is that it's not going to be integrating health and social care with community institutions sufficiently. And that is the essential need that we have, I think, across both health and social care, to be integrating civil society, community groups, and the provision that happens outside the formal sector. Secondly, part of the same mission is about families and the role of families in health and social care, too often left to pick up the pieces, disregarded, disempowered, disenfranchised, underfunded. And we need to put families back at the centre of health and social care, which leads me on to the question of the point about Hetman, and I couldn't agree more with all that analysis about early years and his agenda on prevention. It comes back to my point I made earlier about the politics of this. You know, the alignment that we have got is around relational politics and a vision of society which is about human connection. And I think there is a need for an alignment between those social conservatives who worry about family stability and those liberal communitarians who think about civil society and making better connected communities. And for me, it's all one agenda. And I'm surprised at the sort of cultural divorce that we have in our politics between people who worry about family stability and people who worry about place. And we should all be the same. We are the same gang. Maybe people on this call represent that new alignment. And lastly, I mean, related to which, the question about how do we ensure there's enough young people in the places we need, bright young people. Well, those places grow their own if the families are strong and if the community is there to support the families, as well as, of course, attracting young people and young professionals with families in through better housing and cultural policy and so on. But I think fundamentally, if we can get our family policy right, we'll find in the next generation we will have cracked a lot of these problems.
Thank you so much, Danny. And by providence or design, and of course they're both the same thing, we have our family policy event at 2 o'clock next Monday, where we've got Miriam Cates MP, James O'Shaughnessy, and chaired by Samantha Callan and a host of other luminaries discussing family policy, which has been a complete absent from the Conservative mindset, and that surely has to change. So do join us at our next event of rethinking Conservative approaches to poverty. Do get in touch with us if you'd like to work with us. And I'd like to thank you, and like to thank Ruth and Mike and David and Danny for what's been a really very, very enjoyable event. Thank you all so very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.